In a desolate land where hope was a luxury, fate united a family on the brink of ruin and a nearly lifeless stranger. They, guided by compassion, extended a hand to a dying cowboy, unaware that this act of kindness would plant the seed of a twist that would change their lives forever. This is the story of a hidden secret, an unexpected promise, and a miracle that blossomed in the desert. Prepare to discover how the simplest of actions can trigger the greatest of rewards. In a small, solitary wooden house in the heart of the 1880s Texas desert, lived the widow Sarah with her 2 children, the brave and protective Lucas, 12, and the sweet, dreamy Ilara, 8. Life there was a constant battle. Ever since their father, a dedicated miner, succumbed to a sudden fever, the family had fought against poverty. The surrounding lands were infertile, the well was nearly dry, and their meager crops were devoured by voracious locusts. Sarah, with hands calloused from daily labor, tried to keep her dignity and hope alive, but despair was a shadow that lengthened with every sunset. Lucas, feeling the responsibility of his father's absence, spent his days hunting small animals and fixing what he could, while Ilara, with the innocence of childhood, sought joy in small gestures, drawing the sun on the beaten earth floor. Sarah's greatest worry was the approaching winter. Food reserves were scarce, and money was a distant memory. The nights were cold and hunger, an unwelcome companion. The mother, with a heavy heart, prayed for a miracle, a sign that they were not alone in that cruel world. One day, as Lucas was returning from a hunt, he spotted something unusual in the distance, near the trail that led to town. It was a thin, tired horse, standing still, and next to it, a man stretched out on the ground, inert. Lucas ran home, his heart pounding, and alerted his mother. Sarah, despite the fear and the precariousness of her own situation, knew she could not ignore the call of humanity. Together, mother and son dragged the heavy, unconscious body of the man into the cabin, with Ilara helping to open the door. The cowboy, a man with rough features and a crumpled hat, was seriously injured, with a bullet lodged in his shoulder and a feverish heat that consumed his body. The wound looked to be days old. Sarah used the last clean cloths to make dressings and a bottle of gin, which her late husband had kept, to disinfect the wound, a desperate and painful measure. Night fell, and the family took turns keeping watch, certain that the man's life was hanging by a thread. Sarah looked at her children and knew that this act of kindness, done for a complete stranger, could cost them the little they had. But deep down, she felt that destiny had a purpose for that night. The days that followed were a tense mix of hope and uncertainty. The cowboy, whose name he barely whispered as Jake, fought to survive. His fever came and went in waves, and with each delirium, he muttered disconnected phrases about a map and a promise. Sarah used all her knowledge of herbs and rudimentary care, learned from her mother, to try to bring down the fever and prevent infection. Lucas, feeling the need to contribute, increased his hunting rounds, often returning empty-handed, which only deepened the family's anguish. The food, already scarce, was now divided between them and the sick man, who needed more to recover. The siblings, despite their fear, saw a new adventure in Jake. Ilara, with her childlike purity, spoke to him even in his unconscious state, telling him stories about their simple farm life and making him small stick horses as gifts. Lucas, in turn, watched the cowboy with a mix of suspicion and respect. Jake's presence was a responsibility and a burden for the family, who were already barely able to support themselves. Jake's horse, a strong but debilitated animal, was a new problem. It needed water and food, resources the family no longer had. Sarah, to save the animal, had to make the difficult decision to sell her last family heirloom, a small gold chain her husband had given her. The buyer, a rude and dishonest merchant in town, took advantage of her situation and paid far less than the piece was worth. Sarah's pain was immense, but the survival of Jake and his horse had somehow become her priority. Meanwhile, a sheriff from a nearby town, the cruel and authoritarian Sheriff Barnes, began making rounds in the area. He questioned Sarah about the presence of strangers, mentioning that a man was being sought in the region for robbery, a supposed criminal who had taken a large sum of money. The sheriff's suspicion, combined with Jake's appearance, torn clothes, and a bullet wound, began to create a new conflict for the widow. Sarah knew that if the sheriff discovered Jake, he wouldn't hesitate to take him away. She needed to protect him, but at the same time, she feared she was harboring a criminal. The tension in Sarah's home increased considerably. Sheriff Barnes, with his relentless search for Silas, began to patrol the region more frequently, and the family had to be extremely cautious to hide Jake. With every noise on the road, Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She, who once feared hunger, now feared prison and violence. Jake, still recovering, felt like a burden, but his mind was in constant work, trying to remember where he had hidden the copy of the map. He knew it was his only chance to prove his innocence and, more importantly, to repay the family that had saved him. The fear that Silas, with the original map, would get to the vein first was immense. Lucas, with his childlike perceptiveness, became the house's sentinel. He would climb a small nearby hill, and, with an old pair of binoculars that had belonged to his father, he would watch the road, alerting the family about the approach of strangers. Elara, in turn, with her unwavering innocence, became Jake's confidant. It was during one of their conversations that the child, playing with a peacock feather she had found, said something that made a light go on in Jake's mind. He had hidden the copy of the map inside one of Elara's storybooks, a book with a leather cover and a drawing of a bird, one of the few belongings his late wife had left him. He remembered tearing out a page from the book and using the book as a disguise. The discovery of the map brought a mix of hope and dread. The map was simple, drawn in pencil, but it was the proof they needed. The location indicated was a cave in the nearby mountains, an isolated and dangerous place. The biggest challenge was to get there without attracting the attention of the sheriff or Silas, who would likely be in the region. Jake, though still weak, felt the urgency of the situation. He knew he had to act quickly, because every day that passed meant Silas was closer to stealing his future. Sarah, in turn, found herself faced with an impossible decision. Helping Jake go in search of the map would put them in danger, but abandoning him now would be to betray the kindness that had brought them together. She looked at her children, at the spark of hope in Lucas's eyes and the purity in Elara's gaze, and knew that the only choice was to continue. They were now a team, a small and unlikely family, united by necessity, kindness, and a map that promised redemption. With the location of the map revealed, the family and Jake prepared for the journey. The trip to the cave was risky and would require them to be away from home for an entire day, a difficult decision for Sarah, who had never left the farm unprotected. Jake, with Lucas's help, prepared the horse, and Sarah gathered the little food and water they had. The tension was palpable. With every step, fear and hope walked side by side. The journey was silent, with Jake guiding the way and Lucas watching the road and surroundings with a keen eye. Elara, with her usual innocence, saw everything as a great adventure, without understanding the danger that surrounded them. Upon reaching the cave, the family was faced with an unexpected and frightening scene. Silas was there. The criminal, a man with a cold appearance and a cynical look, was crouched, trying to decipher the original map he had stolen. He was frustrated, as the copy Jake had made had crucial details that the original lacked. The confrontation was inevitable. Jake, even debilitated, stood in front of Sarah and the children, protecting them. Silas, seeing Jake alive, laughed sarcastically, saying that he was like a pest, but that this time he would finish the job. The sound of a shot echoed through the cave. Panic set in. In the midst of the chaos, Sheriff Barnes, who had been following the clues left by Silas, arrived at the scene. The confrontation became a life-or-death struggle between the three men. The sheriff, upon seeing Jake and Silas, was initially confused, but Silas's reaction, who tried to shoot the sheriff, revealed his true nature. The fight was intense, and in the end, Silas was hit. He fell to the ground, and next to him, the map he had stolen. Jake, breathless, was alive but wounded again. The sheriff, upon seeing the copy of the map Jake had made and hearing Sarah and Lucas's account of Jake's innocence, understood the whole situation. He thanked the family for their courage and for not only saving Jake's life, but also for helping to uncover the truth. The sheriff promised that he would take care of Silas and that Jake would be rewarded for his work. The dust settled, and peace finally returned to Sarah's house. Jake, now fully recovered, was no longer a stranger. He was a member of the family, a father to Lucas and Alara, and a companion to Sarah. The sheriff kept his promise. Jake received the gold claim, and the family, who once lived in poverty, was now the owner of one of the richest mines in the state. Money, which was once a worry, became a means to a new life. Sarah, with her eyes full of tears, could finally buy the farm, fix the house, and ensure that her children had an education and a bright future. Lucas, with his perceptiveness, became one of the most reliable and dedicated miners. And Alara, with her joy, could take art classes, painting the desert that had raised her, now with colors of hope. Jake, however, never forgot the family's act of kindness. He, who had been left for dead, was saved by strangers who risked everything for him. He fulfilled his promise to repay them, but what he did for the family was much more than giving them money. He gave them the chance for a new life, a new family, and a new hope. The story of the poor widow and her children spread throughout the region. The family became an example of kindness and courage, proving that even in the darkest of times, compassion can be the light that guides us. The lesson that love for one's neighbor is the greatest wealth one can have was learned and passed down for generations. The story ends with Sarah, Jake, Lucas, and Alara sitting on the porch of the new and prosperous farm, watching the sunset, a symbol of a new beginning. Their hands were joined, their minds at peace, and their hearts full of gratitude. Jake's promise was fulfilled, but the true reward, the true treasure, was not the gold, but the family they had formed. The miracle in the desert was not the gold, but the kindness that saved a life and built a future. After weeks of dedicated care, Jake finally began to show signs of improvement. He opened his eyes, looked around the humble cabin, and saw Sarah, Alara, and Lucas. The shock and gratitude in his gaze were evident. He, who had lived a life of solitude and danger, never expected to find such kindness. As he told his story, the family listened in astonishment to a revelation that would change everything. Jake was not a criminal, but a former miner who had discovered the location of a rich gold vein. He and his partner, a man named Silas, had worked for months in secret, mapping the area and planning the extraction. However, on the night they were to seal a deal for the sale of the claim, Silas betrayed him, shot him, and left him for dead, taking the map and the location of the gold. The money the sheriff was looking for was not stolen, but the initial payment for the claim that Jake was supposed to receive and that Silas, the true criminal, had taken. Jake's story revealed the true nature of the conflict and the reason behind his flight. He wasn't a fugitive, but a victim. He recounted that, before the attack, he had made a copy of the map and hidden it, fearing a betrayal. The original map, he feared, was with Silas. However, his precarious condition and pain prevented him from being clear about what he had done with the copy. The murmurs in his delirium about the map and the promise now made sense. The promise was to his late wife that he would one day make her rich and happy. Sarah, upon hearing the story, felt immense relief, but also a new kind of fear. Sheriff Barnes, who was after Silas, could easily confuse them. And with the revelation of the gold, The family, already fragile, found themselves in the middle of a dangerous manhunt. Jake, still weak, sensed Sarah's worry and, in a moment of clarity, said, "Sarah, I owe my life to you and your children. Your kindness saved me, and I promise that, one way or another, I will repay you." He began to try to describe the map, but the pain and weakness prevented him from finishing. The family, in turn, felt torn. Jake's promise was tempting, but the danger of getting involved in the hunt for gold and a criminal was real. Sarah, however, had already made her choice. The compassion that guided them at the beginning of this story was the only thing of value they had, and she did not regret it. The family now had a new purpose: to help Jake retrieve the map and the justice he deserved. Without knowing that the true value of that act of kindness would be far greater than any gold nugget.